America's voter turnout trails most other peer democracies. At 55%, even in a presidential election year, that turnout rate ranks 26th out of 35 other nations, below Mexico and Greece. One of the reasons could be that voting in America is on a Tuesday, a weekday, and that can be a hassle. According to surveys conducted by the U.S. Census Bureau, many people don't vote because they are either too busy or have conflicting work or school schedules. By comparison, many other countries with higher turnout rates vote on weekends or holidays. Why then doesn't the US just vote on weekends or holidays too? The answer goes back to 1792, when America's Congress set out to personify the country's new constitution into a set of laws. When it came to setting up elections, that Congress designated a multi-week period roughly spanning the month of November. They chose November because farmers would be busy with planting and harvest in the spring, summer, and early fall, while cold weather would prevent people from turning out in the winter. Beyond that, though, Congress left it up to the states, allowing them to take their own needs into account when setting up specific dates. This setup made sense when you think about the geography of the United States at that time. This was a massive and rugged country, connected via a network of patchy, unpaved roads. It took information a long time to travel from one place to another, and life varied greatly state by state. But as economic and technological progress began to bring the country closer together during the first half of the 1800s, fears began to emerge that results in states with earlier elections could start impacting how people voted in states with later elections. In 1845, Congress moved to designate one day for presidential elections, and believe it or not, they were looking for a day everyone could take off. Sunday wouldn't work because it would interfere with religious activities. Monday wouldn't work because many farmers would need a day to travel to polling places, but Tuesday made sense. Citizens could travel on Monday, vote Tuesday, then be back home in time for market day on Wednesday. So Tuesday it was. As the country evolved over the past 175 years, though, that day picked for its agrarian convenience created problems of its own.
Tuesday is a really inconvenient day for a lot of people because a lot of people work on the weekdays. You imagine a person wakes up, drops off their kids at school, goes to work, picks up their kids at daycare. That could be a really full day, and finding time to get to a polling station in the middle of that can be really tricky for a lot of people.
Even though many employers are required by state laws to give time off for voting, laws vary state by state, and employees can still feel informal pressure to skip voting.
I think that there are a lot of people who don't vote because it's difficult, right? Because something comes up and it's hard for them to find time.
In a Washington Post op-ed arguing for holiday voting, Harvard professor Michael McFaul and Stanford professor Adam Bonica outline this disparity. Drawing from census data, they argue the highest turnout comes from salaried professionals with flexible work schedules such as lawyers, educators, and executives, while the lowest turnout comes from hourly paid workers in service jobs in restaurants and retail. For those working people who do vote, the cost can be very real. MIT political scientist Charles Stewart estimates waiting in line collectively cost 2012 voters about $500 million in lost wages. Tuesday voting may also increase wait time for many voters at the polls.
For most people, the most convenient times to vote on Tuesday tend to be either in the morning before work or in the evening after work. And so polling stations tend to have pretty long lines when they first open and right before they close, whereas in the middle of the day they tend to be a lot more empty.
Those lines also disproportionately impact lower income and minority communities. According to research by Stephen Pettigrew at University of Pittsburgh, voting lines are about twice as long in predominantly minority communities, and minority voters are 6 times as likely to wait longer than an hour to vote. Moving elections to weekends or holidays could help alleviate some of these issues.
So if everybody had the day off, it would be a lot easier for people to find the time to vote. It would also change the pattern of voting. People's schedules are going to be spread out a lot more evenly throughout the day. So that could be shorter times to go and vote when people actually do go to the polling sites. It would increase the availability of poll workers, and especially if we had it as a national holiday, it would create sort of a civic spirit. It would give us the opportunity to really spread that civic duty and all of those social norms, which have been shown to really increase turnout.
But experts remain lukewarm on whether pursuing reform is actually a good idea, noting some of the very people the idea was meant to help might not even have weekends or holidays off.
There's a lot of people that have to work on these national holidays, and they tend to be lower income, underrepresented, disadvantaged groups, people who are working minimum wage, people who are working hourly jobs.
A U.S. government report commissioned by Congress that looked into the possibility of holding elections on weekends also outlined a variety of potential logistical issues. Most election officials interviewed actually said it would be harder to find poll workers and polling locations on weekends. It turns out many poll volunteers are county employees being paid for a full day's work or high school students being offered exemptions from class. Many polling locations are also churches with weekend worship services or schools with weekend events. Surveyed officials worried those locations might be harder to reserve and access. Finally, the cost of paying staff overtime for weekend work and potentially holding the elections over 2 days to not interfere with any one denomination's religious services could present major cost increases. Officials who had already held local and primary elections on weekends also noted that poll workers were simply less likely to show up on Saturday or Sunday. In addition to that report, experts on voting lines have voiced their own concerns.
I do think that there's merit in some of those reforms, moving to a weekend or making election day a holiday, but probably not going to impact the lines.
Lines, these experts say, aren't as prevalent as people tend to think.
There's a perception out there that they are a widespread problem. I do think the media is very good at finding the lines and putting those lines on television and focusing on the problems. I don't think the perception meets the reality. My organization, the Bipartisan Policy Center, decided to figure out a way to actually get the precinct level data. What we saw was lines are not necessarily a widespread problem, but where there are problems, they can be very severe. And we also know that the impact of long lines is not spread evenly across races, levels of income.
Still, even in places with severe line problems, it's unclear if the cause is voting on a workday. With the Bipartisan Policy Center's research citing everything from funding to precinct size and location, poll workers, voting machine technical issues, timing of voter arrival, and even ballot length as causes for long lines. And as the U.S. continues to grapple with questions of how systemic racial discrimination might relate to closure of polling stations in and diversion of election resources away from minority communities, simply changing when voting occurs leaves those larger structural issues in place. There's also academic pushback on the notion that weekend and holiday voting in many other countries with higher turnout rates offers proof that Tuesday voting in the U.S. suppresses turnout.
There's so many other differences between the United States and those countries. So it's hard to determine which particular factors are affecting the lower levels of turnout in the U.S.
Voter turnout does appear lower than other countries. I do take some issue with whether or not we are all calculating turnout in the same way.
We have many more elections than other countries in the world. So we're holding primary elections, we're holding general elections, we got midterm elections, we got local elections. So part of the difference that we're seeing here is people in the United States have so many opportunities to participate that they just decide to pick and choose which elections they're going to participate in.
There's also questions over whether widespread low turnout is still a major problem in the U.S.
Over the past 2 cycles especially, we're seeing relatively high turnout. I mean, our turnout during the 2018 election nationally was the highest in almost a century for a midterm election. So, I do think that we are doing better.
There used to be a big issue. What's happened over the last 15 years or so is that the American turnout for presidential elections and last time for midterms has gone up a lot, and most other countries that don't have compulsory voting has gone down. That's not to say there isn't still usually a gap, but it's not a huge turnout problem anymore, and that's largely because people are more interested and excited by and about politics.
In other words, low turnout may be more about civic engagement than the day of the week. Even so, no matter how much you do to make voting easier, many experts say a certain percentage of the population simply won't vote.
The biggest reason people don't vote is because they're not interested. Australia has compulsory voting. 10% of the people break the law by not voting and 5% spoil their ballots. In a place where elections are held on a Saturday, where you can vote by mail beforehand, where you can go to a pre-polling place and vote in person beforehand, there's just people who don't want to do this. And it's very hard for people who do want to do it to understand that, but it's real.
But in America, where you have to register in order to vote, turnout is in the 86% range for registered voters, meaning making it easier to register or just automatically registering everyone might boost turnout more than weekend or holiday voting.
There are a number of states that require you to register 30 days before an election. And that can be problematic because for a lot of people that might not think about the election until the weeks before actual election day when the campaign gets really intense and it's really in the news. And so a lot of people get shut out before the election because they missed that deadline.
And the reality is, many across the country can actually already vote on weekends.
Well, we have weekend voting and holiday voting in a lot of states already, effectively through early voting.
Early voting designates a window before Election Day where citizens can vote in person at various polling sites, while mail voting allows someone to have the state send them a ballot. That person can then fill the ballot out at their convenience and return it to the state when they're ready for it to be counted.
It's only really a handful of states left that don't have some sort of no excuse early voting, either by mail or in person. And so I don't really think that necessarily we need to move to having Election Day on a holiday or on the weekend. We just need to clean up these last few states that don't allow this convenience voting.
39 states offer early voting. 33 states offer some form of mail voting. Experts have said that mail-in voting especially can offer some unique advantages.
It's really nice for a lot of people because they get the ballot and they can fill it out at home on their own time. It likely leads to more informed voting because people can sit with their ballot and take the time to figure out the different races.
One of the cheapest ways to run elections is through all-mail ballot elections. You don't have to have a costly polling location. You don't need to have lots of voting equipment. And so if you want to do the cheapest way of running elections, you do all-mail ballot elections. By the way, those all-mail ballot elections, they tend to have some of the highest turnout rates in the country as well, not just in federal and state elections, but also in local elections.
Weekend voting has also faced political hurdles in Washington.
One thing that's difficult about electoral reform is you need to convince the people in power to change the system that put them in power.
When Congress has actually taken up the question of weekend or holiday voting, the issue has come down on party lines.
It's a partisan issue. There's this perception that anything that's going to increase turnout is likely going to benefit the Democratic Party because when we do surveys of people, non-voters, tend to say that they would support Democratic candidates.
For example, only Democrat congressmen supported the 2017 Weekend Voting Act and, more recently, the For the People Act, which, among other things, would have made Election Day a federal holiday. In short, weekend or holiday voting might not quite be the quick fix originally suggested. Right now, there's not enough political will to make this reform on a national level. Its ability to jeopardize the re-election of those already in power and the partisan nature of the wider turnout debate create serious political hurdles to passing it in Congress. Experts also seem unconvinced by the evidence to claim that weekend or holiday voting would significantly increase turnout. Instead, many point to other reforms, like early voting or mail-in ballots, which already offer de facto non-workday voting. But at the state level, these other reforms are gaining steam with pockets of both Democrats and Republicans, resulting in a growing body of election law that encourages more participation in our democracy.